get started. I said to someone, Milton says at the beginning of Paradise Lost, I will have fit audience, though few. So we have a fit audience. And I welcome you to, I'm Ralph Wood, I teach in the Great Text program here at Baylor, to this panel on vocation character at Modern University. And we have 4 speakers, and I'll introduce them one by one so you will have a fresh memory when they present. The first is David Cunningham. He's director of the Network for Vocation and Undergraduate Education called NET, B-U-E, uppercase. He also holds a faculty appointment in religion at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. He's been previously director of the Crossroads Project, a really funded program at Hope, for the theological exploration of vocation. Prior to that, he served as director of the Scholarly Resources Project, overseeing the development and editing of 3 books, all by Oxford Press. He's published 5 books of his own, 2 edited volumes, Christian Theology and Ethics, and his undergraduate degree in Communication Studies is from Northwestern, a Master's in Theology and Religious Studies from Cambridge, and his PhD from Duke. A friend of many years, David Cunningham.
Thanks. So I am not one of the main 3 speakers in this event today. I'm going to do some framing at the beginning and the end for the 3 panelists who will follow. And I want to say a little bit about the way in which this panel came together. As Ralph said, I direct the Network for Vocation and Undergraduate Education, NetView, a follow-on program to the Lilly Endowment's Programs for the Theological Exploration of Vocation that were large grants given to 88 institutions nationwide. Baylor was one of them in the early 2000s. And this program has sort of expanded that conversation beyond the original 88 institutions, now over 250 colleges and universities nationwide, all of whom are finding the language of vocation and calling to be useful in helping undergraduates think about their future. NetView institutions kind of mirror the map of liberal arts colleges across the country, a lot in the Northeast, upper Midwest, upper South, way out here on the West Coast, one all by itself out here in the middle of the interior West. Map of liberal arts colleges would look pretty similar, so it's a similar distribution. So NetView has a number of programs and projects that it offers to its member institutions, some professional development opportunities, programming opportunities for vocational exploration programs for students, opportunities for a lot of conversation and networking. We do a big national conference every other year and some smaller regional events in the off years. But especially relevant for this presentation is the last item on this, which says helping institutions consider their own vocations. Institutions often talk about their mission, and that's a useful term, but we've also found that vocation can be a useful term at the institutional level. A mission comes from the Latin word for sending, so it's a sending forth, and missions are often thought of as something that's started by an important figure or a group of figures at the beginning and sort of sent the college out on its job, right, to do its work in the world. But colleges are also called into the future in a certain way. And so our presenters today are going to be talking to some degree about how institutions have thought through their vocations and are using that process of thinking to help students do the same. So bear that angle in mind as we move forward here. I think there are also a couple of other themes that we've seen among the very many institutions that are working on this topic that sort of run through this panel. One of those is story or narrative. That there's a certain coherence between the language of narrative and the language of vocation. Part of what it means to think about a call is to think about the story that you are a part of, into which you're being called. And time and space are interesting categories also, I think, for a lot of our institutions. Colleges have the attention of students for a limited amount of time. Not just in any given day, but over the course of a 4-year undergraduate career. And they have a fairly designated space that they can operate in. And that time and space are things that institutions can capitalize on to think about vocation for their help students think about vocation and for their own institutional vocational discernment, if we can call it that. So our three panelists, who Ralph will, as he said, will introduce individually, are going to approach this topic from somewhat different angles, but all of them are thinking about the character of the modern university and the place of vocational discernment, both among students and at the institution as a whole. And I hope you'll find their presentations to weave together in interesting ways. And I'll come back up at the end and say just a little bit more about NetView, and we'll open it up to questions. We're going to try to keep it within an hour, so there'll be plenty of time for conversation and discussion. So, Ralph,
okay.
Over to Charlie.
Our next second speaker is Charlie, I may call him Pinches, longtime professor of theology at the University of Scranton. He's published a number of articles and books on Christian ethics, among them Christians Among the Virtues, with his mentor, Stanley Hauerwas, and a book called Theology in Action. So, Charlie.
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. So as David was mentioning, all of us are connected in some way or another with NetView, the organization that is now, 250 or so schools? And so as we've been involved with this over time, I think some of us have asked, well, how can the language of vocation help in where we stand currently in the modern university, particularly the modern faith-based or Christian university? And I've also, as I've thought through that matter, noticed also how it can easily get co-opted. So the concern that underlies my paper, which I'm going to read if you don't mind, both tries to identify some of the promises that are in vocation language, I think, but also some of the pitfalls. So that's the kind of take that I want to do. And I'll speak not so much about the institutional calling, but also how calling as a language, or calling or vocation, I'll use those terms interchangeably, might apply to what we do with students. So the title of the paper is called Can Call Help? For a variety of reasons, modern American university education is conflicted, bipolar even, torn between two widely divergent goals: offering students opportunity, which generally means to them that the university will help them get what they want, and character formation, which must mean that their education will change them to want something much different and much better than what they would want if all they wanted was opportunity. The notion of calling or vocation, arising as it does primarily, although not exclusively, within the Christian tradition, may carry promise for addressing this predicament. The university might be a place in which students begin to discover their callings and are equipped to serve in them well. However, easily enough, vocation can be sucked into the vortex of getting the job or the status or the lifestyle I always wanted. When this happens, it can help us very little. In what follows, I focus on three different, albeit related points, where the dominant accent on opportunity and the deeper concern for character formation or transformation converge. And I attempt to suggest in each how the language and tradition of calling or vocation, if rightly conceived, might help. As well, I suggest how calling can be co-opted and turned into something else. I conclude with something practical related to how specifically religious institutions of higher learning might quietly invite students into the called life. So the first category that I want to speak of is call and choice. Bill Cavanaugh has recently written about vocation under this provocative title. Actually, you can't be anything you want, and it's a good thing too. The Atlantic's Luke Eplin has noticed how the idea that you can be anything you want is the unspoken premise of almost every kids movie on the market, where a young hero has a big dream, encounters a little difficulty as he pursues it, but in the end, gets it all. He gets to be whatever he wanted to be. The notion that we can be anything we want releases us from all constraints that might determine our wants or limit our choices. While this sounds like liberation, We all know cases where it turns out to be the reverse. For instance, in Jesus' story, the prodigal son acts on what he wants, cuts loose from his family, squanders his inheritance on riotous living, and ends up destitute. We can choose badly. If we choose anything we want, we might choose something that can destroy us. Sometimes we need to be saved from our wants and choices. We meet the prodigal son at the end of a long string of choices. College students mostly stand at its beginning, and so it is perhaps easier for them to see the invitation to be anything they want as attractive. Yet, as Kavanaugh notes, young adults, especially those emerging from college, are often told not only, quote, that they can and must choose their life, but they must maximize that choice and choose the best life. But they do not really know what they want. How does anyone really know what kind of life he wants? Can people choose what sorts of lives are right for them before they have lived enough to know? The whole exercise of choosing one's vocation seems fraught with anxiety, says Kavanaugh. The irony of our modern accent on choice is that it has put us in the desperate position of having to choose a meaningful life in a world where the only meaning we can find is based on our inventing it. In this context, we will be tempted to use call as a way of providing the meaning we think we need to make a choice. Having a vocation might seem to promise us salvation from the tyranny of choice. Choosing a vocation in this way can become little more than a choice to release us from the tyranny of choice. On the other hand, openness to call, conceived as a summons that comes to us from outside us, from a truthful source who points us in a new, better direction, can encourage us to see that others, including those others we encounter in our struggle in the university, might know more than we do about how our lives might be better lived. Understood in this way, call urges us to become less fixed on our present wants and desires and more attuned to how we might need to grow to become people who want better things. And we can begin to notice how our lives depend on others' gifts, gifts that constrain us in the sense that they hold us fast by ties of love and obligation. We need to be open to call not simply by desperation of our choices, but by a willingness to receive a gift and to put our lives in the hands of another. Christians believe that God comes to us in this way. As God does, we must be prepared to discern how best to respond to the gift, with others' help, of course. Once discerned, our calls will be something we can say yes to choose, not as a way of inventing ourselves, but as an opportunity to hand ourselves over. In the process, we can discover that we cannot be anything we want to be, and as Kavanaugh notes, that's a good thing too. So a second loci really is, or locus, is a call and struggle. Joseph Campbell once described vocation as following your bliss. Perhaps someday it will bring us bliss, but this is not the place to start, especially with college students. We tend to think of our callings exclusively as the work we do in the world, some job or task or service to someone. Callings are that, but this is only half the story. For call is always reflexive, which means it is about us and how we need to change and grow. We are not generally eager to do this. Change and growth can be very painful. Christians understand their call as from Jesus and to discipleship. Come follow me. But the path to which the disciples are called leads to the cross. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who followed the call all the way to death in the Nazi concentration camps. Oh, I can't believe that's me.
Can call help.
It's a robocall, I'm sure. Okay. Yeah, somehow we should be able to work that in. Okay, back to serious matters of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So Bonhoeffer says this: no man can choose such a life for himself. No man can call himself to such a destiny. That is the destiny of the cross. The gulf between a voluntary offer to follow and genuine discipleship is clear. That's the end of Bonhoeffer's quote. The New Testament offers many stories of call, but one stands out because it leads to a refusal. A rich young man comes to Jesus wanting eternal life. They talk about keeping the commandments and so on. But then we hear this from Mark. Jesus looked at him, loved him, and said, "You lack one thing. Go, sell what you own, and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." When he heard this, he was shocked and went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Commenting on this story, Bonhoeffer suggests that the rich young man is primarily interested in an academic answer. He wants to talk about religion with Jesus, not about himself. Says Bonhoeffer, he had hoped to avoid committing himself to any definite moral obligations by forcing Jesus to discuss his spiritual problems. He hoped Jesus would offer him a solution for his moral difficulties. But instead, he finds Jesus attacking not his question, but himself. End quote. We are tempted to think of finding our vocation as the gateway to smooth traveling. In a time of so many complicated choices, we even hope that call will provide us a sure way of knowing what we are supposed to be doing. As Christians, especially evangelical Christians, can be tempted to offer call as a way out of confusion. Call, we might imagine, comes to us as a fully determined plan that God has worked out for us, like a roadmap. This view of call says, God has a plan for you, and you need to get with it. You need to read the signs to find the plan. And once you do, and you stick with it, you will prosper spiritually, and perhaps even materially. The book of Job shows us where this kind of thinking leads and why it is theological hogwash. A reminder that call is always reflexive can prepare us better for the struggle that accompanies the called life. If call is not only about tasks undertaken and successfully completed, but about what happens within us who are called, then we can be a little less anxious as we receive it. Call is less about determining which school to go to, or profession to enter, or spouse to marry, and more about what happens to us after we find ourselves living into the shape of the commitments we make. For students, this could mean that when they arrive at University 1, whether because they chose it or their parents commanded it, they need not worry so much about whether they are in God's plan, whether perhaps God was telling them to go to University number 2, and they just somehow misheard. They can, rather, get right down to the work of being a student there, to struggle at this, and learning will be a struggle if they are really interested in growing. To conclude this section, call and struggle go together, not only because the work we are called to do in the world is difficult and requires sacrifice and perseverance, but also because we ourselves are in need of reconstruction. As we follow our callings, we will be changed, and the change will be likely painful. Students in our classroom are no strangers to pain, but they have typically little idea what to do with it, likely because they are intuitively aware that any meaning they invent, the kind of meaning their culture offers, is no match for the pain they feel. Call does nothing to eliminate the pain, but does hold out that growth is possible in relation to it, a point that can be displayed to students by telling and following stories of other called lives where great pain and great meaning and purpose are held seamlessly together. There's a final little section called Call and Limits. David Cunningham, this one, has recently described the word vocation as capacious, dynamic, and elastic. Wisely, he has added, a word can become so capacious, so dynamic, and so elastic that it means nothing at all. Taken together, his comments imply that first, there is room in our talk about vocation for a variety of different perspectives, and second, that we need to be careful since we cannot use the term however we like. Among the things Cunningham identifies as part of the capaciousness of God's call is that it accommodates a variety of theological perspectives. Christians can affirm this wholeheartedly, for they believe that God calls each one of us as the particular human beings we are, and not all of us are Christians. Further, the call is to a certain kind of work that relates to the person's gifts as well as her specific time and place, work that builds the reign of God, which is wide and expansive. Yet Cunningham adds another comment that might mislead. Speaking about how others outside of the Christian faith might regard call, he says, if one's vocation is narrowly defined as the human response to the specific call of God, and if God is understood as in specifically Christian terms, why would a follower of another faith tradition or philosophical perspective be the least bit interested in having a vocation? This suggests that vocation might be marketed from one tradition to another, and if it is too Christian, others might not buy it. Vocation is not really something we adopt or buy. It is a gift we receive. This actually opens it up, for the gift can come to us as we are, irrespective of our personal merits, our social or economic status, or our religious training. If people, be they Hindus, Christians, Jews, Muslims, or none of the above, share the conviction that each human being in his or her distinct situation can receive the gift of call, then each human being is summoned to rise above the narrow concerns of our animal wants and needs to live a more challenging and worthy life. Shouldn't all such people be listening for a call? If we listen for it and hear it, this should be enough to prompt us to take a further look into what it might actually mean for us to follow it. And here is where we need religious traditions to be themselves. What is the shape of the new life we have been called to? To learn this, won't we need to learn about the voice that was calling? If we ask this with genuine openness, we will be eager to hear religious traditions speak from their hearts. Since call is understood to be of divine origin, the called one will need to know more about who God really is. And for this, she will need help. As she receives it, she will also need to receive instruction about what God does not call us to. While Christians, for instance, can affirm that God calls each one because they have experience with the God who calls, they can't always affirm that what this one thinks he heard is from God. Religious traditions set limits on what we can be called to do with our lives. We need these limits. Without them, call, in Cunningham's words, becomes so capacious and elastic as to mean nothing at all. Religious communities give space for God's call to particular individuals to a particular life, but they also limit the space. They hold the person who believes he is called accountable. We need these traditions to speak within themselves about their limits, providing reasons that are rooted in genuinely communal theological understanding. A critical theological perspective rooted in a particular faith tradition prevents call or calling from simply merging with the reigning social and political assumptions that cohere with worship of the God of civil religion, like the God of the American way. Such traditions need not dictate all the answers to students' questions about what they might be called to, but they set the context for the discussions of the limits that claims of being called must observe. And they draw attention to the extraordinary shape that such a called human life can take as it reaches towards full participation in the life of God. So that's the conclusion of the paper. I just also then, I wanted to leave, I know I found out my colleagues had some slides, so, and I only have a cell phone that rings. So, but I did, as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, in that context, then what can we display to our students? I think it's important that we don't think about call just in terms of like, okay, what kind of job are you going to get? But our universities ought to be infused with a vision of call. But that infusion has to also function as an invitation. And so I think there are two ways, so I thought about this in my own institution, I thought about two ways in which I think we do that for the general students. We have many failings. But I thought I'd just show you a couple of pictures, and I know my colleagues have pictures of their institution. So here's the University of Scranton. And so one way in which I think we can display call, and now not as like, okay, get this job or do these things, but rather as an opening door to a different way of seeing one's life and a different way of living. And fundamental to that, as I try to argue, is struggle. And so at the top of the hill in the University of Scranton, we have a very hilly campus. At the very top, It's a statue of Jacob and the angel, but it might be God. And it's really compelling. It's a compelling statue. And you can see that students walk by, and I had the students walk by partly. I mean, they were doing that, so I snapped a picture when they were doing it. And, but in fact, they might not notice. But there it is. I think our campuses need to be marked, and actually Catholic schools do a much better job on this than many other schools. So then you go down the hill, and here's Ignatius. So ours is a Jesuit institution. And Ignatius is a statue called Metanoia. So Ignatius, Inigo has actually become Ignatius in this realization. And so similarly, kind of giving oneself over. And at the bottom, I'm not quite so sure about this one, but this is called Christ the Teacher, and actually at the bottom of the hill. So as you move through the campus from the top to the bottom of the hill, this is where you discover it's actually closest to the city. So it's fitting that Jesus is there with a kind of unnamed woman. The sculptor said, I didn't have anybody in particular in mind, but some nameless person. So, and Jesus is actually works out. But there's a kind of strength that's implied. So she's downtrodden, obviously. And then the other way, so that's just in terms of how we display, or the kind of portals we might open to students' imagination. And then one other thing that I direct the first year seminar at our university, and so one thing that I really try to work on is giving them stories of force and content that are about a called life, or a life that includes a great deal of struggle. And that can be integrated also with a vision of meaning for their lives. These are the books that we used in the last 3 years, and you may know some of them. I won't go over them. And then frequently enough, students don't read them. But nonetheless, they stand there as a sort of invitation to, there's something larger and better that your life can grow towards. And it seems to me that that's one of the ways in which call can continue to function in our institutions. So thank you.
Our third panelist is Caryn Riswold.
Actually, sorry, no.
We're going to switch the order.
Kurt is going next.
Sorry,
We
forgot to
changed
tell you
it.
that.
Sorry.
I apologize.
That's
No, it's
okay.
my fault.
We have Kurt.
Yes.
Schackmuth. But I have a greater problem. He is Vice President for Missions and Associate Provost for Student Success at Lewis University in Romeo, Illinois, or is it Romeo, Illinois?
Romeoville.
Romeo, Illinois. Can't beat that. Where one of my former students teaches. Holds a PhD in higher education from Loyola in Chicago, responsible for the university's efforts. I like this to promote its Catholic and Lasallian mission and identity through mission-based hiring, mission-based orientation, mission-based formation programs, as well as through a variety of other initiatives, including vocational exploration. He's responsible also for a variety of student success initiatives, departments, including the Center for Academic Success and Enrichment, and serves as the chair of the National Lasallian Education Council, and part of the governing structure for the network of educational institutions and ministries sponsored by the De La Salle Christian Brothers, which, as I understand, is primarily a teaching order.
Correct.
So,
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that Charles just mentioned. He mentioned doorways, portals, and invitation, and those are some things I'm going to talk about actually. So what I want to talk a little bit about is physical space and how that can help to, along with story, help to prompt vocational exploration for students. And as Ralph mentioned, I'm coming from Lewis University, which is in Romeoville, Illinois. It's just southwest of Chicago. We are a Catholic institution sponsored by the De La Salle Christian Brothers. We have 6,500 students, and we were founded in 1932 as an aviation technical high school. So one of our really unique programs is we have an airport on campus, and we have 500 students who are in any number of aviation-related programs, in addition to 89 other undergraduate and 37 graduate programs. So I want to start by telling you the story, and if you happen to have one of the handouts that we distributed earlier, this will give you a little bit of a synopsis, because I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. So, as Ralph mentioned, we're sponsored by the De La Salle Christian Brothers, which are indeed a group of men who are dedicated to teaching. So the Christian Brothers don't run hospitals, they don't run orphanages, they run educational institutions. And they were founded by St. John Baptist de La Salle, who lived in France from 1651 to 1719. And he was a wealthy French priest, from a really well-known family in Reims, France. There was a chance encounter that changed his life, and that's what I'm going to talk about in terms of this story. And that chance encounter drew him into a world that he was not familiar with, which was the world of the poor. Now, as a priest in France, he was aware of the struggles of the poor, but not in a close way. And so he ended up being drawn into this world, starting schools for young poor boys in France at this time, created a religious order of men dedicated to staffing and teaching in those schools, and then that resulted in a worldwide network that still exists today, educating 1 million students in 1,000 institutions across the world, 64 of which are universities. And so we call this LaSallian network today kind of the legacy of De La Salle and the current work of about 4,000 Christian brothers that serve in those institutions worldwide. So I mentioned this chance encounter. So this is a painting that depicts an incident in De La Salle's life that occurred in March of 1679. De La Salle was visiting the Sisters of the Holy Child Jesus. He was visiting their convent because he said Mass for them every day. And he was also taking care of some business matters for them. So he was visiting them one day, and he happened upon this gentleman by the name of Adrien Niel. And Adrien Niel was sent from Rouen, France to Reims with a pocket full of money that he was given by a rich widow. And she said to Adrien, go found some schools for poor boys in France. The sisters are known for running schools for poor girls in France. So go visit them. They'll give you some good insights into how you can get started. So Adrien Niel and De La Salle encounter one another on the doorstep of the convent. They introduce each other, they go on inside, and it's in this encounter, in this meeting, that they discover themselves and they begin to talk a little bit about why they're visiting the sisters. Adrien Niel says to De La Salle, I need some help founding some schools. I'm really not sure what to do. I'm new in town. De La Salle, who's well connected and networked in the town, in the city, says, I know how things work here. Let me help you out a little bit. Why don't you come and stay with me for a few days? I'll show you the ropes. I'll connect you with the right people in town. I'll help you a little bit, and we'll see what happens. So Adrien Niel goes and visits De La Salle, spends some time with him at his house. Next thing you know, De La Salle is finding that the work that Adrien Niel is interested in doing, founding schools for poor boys, is something that really appeals to him. And he's interested. And so he gets drawn into this world that he had no intention of being drawn into. Today, when we talk about De La Salle, we talk about this guy who was very likely to move very quickly up in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. He could have been a bishop or a cardinal had he stayed in the role that he was currently in at the time that he met Adrien Niel. And so this particular image is important to us in terms of the De La Salle story, because once De La Salle crossed through that doorway, he eventually made some decisions in his life that changed the way that he would pursue his vocation. So towards the end of his life, De La Salle says this: God, who guides all things with wisdom and serenity, and whose way it is not to force the inclinations of persons, willed to commit me entirely to the development of the schools. He did this in an imperceptible way and over a long period of time, so that one commitment led to another in a way that I did not foresee in the beginning. So let's talk a little bit about the space. So that's the inspiration story. And when we were thinking about creating a space that would somehow prompt vocational exploration, we started with a donor. We asked a donor, we started having conversations with a donor about building an iconic monument on our campus. And he came to us and said, I want to help you build something. He had previously been involved in helping to add additions to buildings and help with classroom structures. But he said, I want to help you build something that will be iconic, that people will remember when they visit your campus. And we said, okay, so we'll talk about this. Well, we talked about it for almost 4 years before we finally came up with this vision for a monument. And the idea behind this monument is we wanted to introduce students to our mission as a Catholic and LaSallian institution. We wanted to focus on De La Salle's vocation story because it was significant and it was impactful. And we also wanted to make sure that we could not just put a monument on campus and forget about it, but we really wanted to program around it. We wanted to do things with it. And so we went back to this image because this was a really powerful image in the LaSallian world, in the LaSallian network, and in the story of who De La Salle ultimately became. And we decided that we would do something to kind of take our inspiration from this painting. So we went to France, not physically. I didn't get to go, but we looked at images, and this is that actual doorway today. Now the doors have been replaced, and it's probably been changed a little bit over time, but this is the door that that painting is based upon. And we said, all right, so that's cool inspiration for something here. We've got something. It took us 4 years to come up with this design and to get the donor to agree with it. But this is ultimately what we built, and we call this the Encounter. And it's, I wouldn't call it a recreation, but I would call it a structure that is inspired by this pivotal moment in De La Salle's life. And so when you zoom up a little bit closer, there's essentially here a doorway with De La Salle extending his arm, inviting someone through the doorway. Now, De La Salle went through that doorway at the invitation of Adrian Niel, or they kind of did it together. We wanted to kind of turn the story a little bit and change the narrative a bit. And so the idea behind this is that we're inviting our students into the mission of the university and into an opportunity to reflect on the big questions of life. In particular, what do you want to be when you grow up? What's going to make a difference in your life that's going to give you purpose and meaning? And so De La Salle is inviting students through the doorway, or anybody really, but particularly students. And we worked with a sculptor who helped us come up with a really unique, one-of-a-kind sculpture of De La Salle. From concept phase to completion, it was about 18 months. Did an amazing job. No other statue of him looks like this anywhere because it's unique just to us. And this was an opportunity for us to create a structure that would have some sort of an impact on our students in a very special way. And so when we talk about this experience of using the Encounter with our students, we thought about this very carefully in terms of design. So the Encounter Monument is in the center of our campus, and it's near kind of the main north-south sidewalk that runs across campus. And the statue of De La Salle is about as tall as I am. So students can look right into his eyes, they can touch him, they can get very close to him. This wasn't meant to be something that's way up on a pedestal where no one could get to it. So it's meant to be very personal. Those doors that you saw are fixed in the open position, and it's meant so that nobody can play around with the concept of what we're doing, and it's also just safer to keep them fixed. And then there's also an interpretive display out in front that helps people understand what it is they're looking at. So that handout that you have is the identical text of the display, which is huge. It's 48 by 36 on a big pedestal. And so people who visit the Encounter can read the story and understand it. And then finally, we've integrated it into the curriculum. We've integrated it into events and other activities on campus. And I think this is a really important concept because today students learn through experience. Experiential learning is so important to higher ed into what we do in the classroom and elsewhere. And so this is an experiential opportunity. It's immersive, so we're welcoming students into it, and it's also reflective. And again, it was really important to not put this thing way up high on a pedestal where nobody could get to it. We wanted people to be able to surround it, to experience it, to be part of it. We think of it as an entry point into the mission. So De La Salle is welcoming students to Lewis University to better understand who we are as an institution. What I really like about the design, though, is that De La Salle is extending an arm and inviting students in, and so students walk through the doorway. The idea, though, is that when students leave the university, De La Salle's arm is also pointing outwards, and so he's encouraging them to leave. And so in the LaSallian tradition, we have a phrase, enter to learn, leave to serve. And in a way, that's what the monument helps to focus on. It's also an easier way to introduce the really complex topic of vocation. We know that it is a charged word. It's often associated with religious life. And it's one that's hard to just introduce to students in the classroom only. And so this is an opportunity, once again, to use physical space to talk about something such as this. It's also physical and tangible. So this is a picture of one of our new first-year students. I'll show a couple more pictures in a minute. actually touching De La Salle. In Springfield, Illinois, state capital of Illinois, there is a bust of Abraham Lincoln, and everyone touches Abraham Lincoln's nose, and his nose is the finish is rubbed off on his nose, and it's bright, bright gold, and that's because everybody touches that. And what we wanted is people to touch De La Salle, to touch his hand, to interact with the sculpture. It's also ritualized, and so one of the first things we did is we said we have to create a ritual to introduce this to students, and so we have 2 rituals right now that we've developed, and we also have some questions and prompts, and those questions are indicated or are listed here on this handout, and they're also embedded into our freshman seminar course, which also unpacks the meaning of this whole monument. So one of the rituals we created is for our first year flyer convocation. So all of our new first year students, they come to a convocation, they hear a keynote address, they are welcomed to the university by all the key people, all the right people, and then we march them out of our field house, and they are led by a handful of De La Salle Christian brothers who walk them through the encounter experience. And so they walk through with their banner, and we managed to put close to 600 first-year students through the encounter in a matter of 20 minutes or so. We weren't sure what to expect. This is the first time we did this past fall. We weren't sure if it was going to be chaotic, if the students would be disrespectful, if they wouldn't get it. But we set it up really well before they went through it. And what was cool is they all went through. Here's a student touching De La Salle's hand. And then on the other side, our president and provost and a couple of Christian brothers shook hands as they came through on the other side. Our hope is that in 2023, when this group of students graduates, we'll have created a ritual for them to march back out through the other way, and De La Salle's arm is pushing them out into the world to go make a difference. And all the magic happens in those 4 years of college, right? They all magically discover their purpose and they know exactly what they're going to do. But it was really important for us to create some tangible experience for students. And so what we have found is that the admission office now has a way to talk about vocation in a way that they didn't have before, because the tour guides and the other staff are walking them past this thing. And I said, it's my worst nightmare for an admission counselor or a student who's leading a tour to go, and that's our statue of De La Salle right there, and they keep walking by. So we've created talking points for them so they can begin to have that conversation. And I think it's especially important for parents that are part of those tours to hear kind of about the value-added experience that the mission gives to students at the university. I mentioned the opening of the school year ritual. We have a freshman seminar called the Cornerstone Seminar, and there are a couple of sessions in that class which are dedicated to mission, and that's one of the places where a few weeks after the students walk through the encounter, where they have more dialogue and reflection about what it was that they experienced and what the encounter means. So we didn't want to just have them do something, but we wanted the reflective component to be present as well. Campus ministry is using the encounter for retreats. People are using it as photo ops. Anytime you walk by, you can see students doing selfies with De La Salle. There are people that dance with De La Salle. They're really having fun engaging with it, which is exactly what we were hoped for. I mentioned the graduation experience we hope to have, and even career services and alumni. Those two officers are making connections with this as well. It's really helped not only the students, I think, connect a little bit in a stronger way with the mission, but our employees seem to get it in a new way as well. And so here's something that's cool. The women's basketball team goes to Reims, France this summer because this is a significant anniversary year in the LaSallian world. And so they did a study pilgrimage trip, and they played basketball while they were there. And so they were with their professor, and they had their picture taken. And now the cool new thing is to have pictures and to go like this. And so they did that in front of those doors in France. And then on the day that we dedicated the encounter, the same group of students came back with their teacher and the donors who helped to fund it, and they had their picture taken with it. So it's beginning to create meaning. It's still too early to know how much of a difference it's making in the lives of our students in terms of that vocational exploration piece. But for me, it was an important way to begin the conversation because, as Charlie mentioned, it is kind of a difficult thing to bring up with students and to engage them in a really interesting, engaging way. So we'll have to see how this turns out long term, but it's really important, I think, to create spaces, and in this case, a physical space that helps students tackle what can be a tough topic.
third panelist is Caryn Riswold, professor of religion, and serves as the Mike and Lawrence McCoy Family Distinguished Chair in Lutheran Heritage and Mission at Wartburg College in Waverly, Iowa. I hope that she would be from Dordt College in Iowa, so I get to tell my favorite story.
You tell it anyway.
I guess you're gonna tell it anyway.
From the novelist Peter DeVries, alas now in print, almost wholly forgotten. But he has a couple whose pillow talk consists of discussing the sin of Dort. And pillow talk. Get something better than pillow talk from Caryn.
Oh dear, okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was gonna grab my water bottle. No, I totally forgot. I sort of happened upon a title and theme a little bit by happenstance, just because I have a jumbled writing notebook in which I sort of write weird things down. I write quotes down and I have notes. And so my notes from the phone meeting that we had to plan this panel, for some reason I ended up with this quotation on the top from Mary Pfeiffer's book, Writing to Change the World, where she says, carefully considered, our stories can shed light on our moral assignments. And when I sat down to sort of pull my thoughts together for this panel, I thought, well, there you go. That's exactly what I need to say. So I think we've already heard two really great examples of how stories that institutions have continue to inform what they do and what we do. And so, because in this context, she was talking about a relationship to memoir and creative nonfiction, but I absolutely think it has something to say to this conversation about the character of a university or a college, whether and how institutions of higher education have calling, what it would mean to have character as an institution, and what that looks like. I do think that the stories that our colleges and universities tell, and the stories we tell about them, shed light on our moral assignments. So in my time here to close out the bulk of our panel today and move us into conversation, I'm going to consider this from two different vantage points. One is as a person who's recently been hired into my institution's endowed chair position in Lutheran Heritage and Mission. It is newly part of my kind of daily and seasonal work to think about how the heritage and story of this particular college, Wartburg College, a Lutheran college, has, how that should inform our institutional vocation and how it does and should shape its character. Second vantage point, so sort of the heritage piece and sort of where I am as a Lutheran Heritage Mission. Second piece is as a feminist theologian who's an educator. It continues to be my vocation on a daily basis to think about how current social and political landscape shapes and is shaped by our theological and moral imperatives and how that impacts students on our campus and in the classroom. So I want to preface all of this with a couple of, I decided these are sort of cynical theological caveats that are informed by my own location in the Christian tradition. First of all, institutions are not created in the image of God, as humans are. Institutions are not graced with any promises of eternal life by a loving creator. And institutions are not infallible, much like the humans who created them, but they're also not simply extensions of our humanity. They're something qualitatively different, and that's why I think they bear our continued scrutiny. So, to talk about story and heritage. So to have character, when I'm thinking about this, includes having some form of guidance for decisions, policies, practices, and for an institution this includes its story and its heritage, its geography, its legal requirements, the cultural landscape. There's lots of things that go into shaping how colleges and universities make decisions on what they choose to do and not to do. The network of ELCA colleges and universities, of which Wartburg College is one, took on the task of articulating a common calling for all 26 of its member institutions a few years ago. The question being, what, if anything, do these diverse colleges and universities have in common? Given the fact that Lutheranism itself looks very different in Iowa, in California, in Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and higher education is increasingly regionally determined, do Lutheran colleges in those places have anything meaningful in common? The work then came from the presidents of those schools, ELCA church-wide staff, and some consulting theologians, and they actually produced about an 8-page document called Rooted and Open, and it was approved last year, I think. And the title comes from this claim that these colleges and universities are, quote, deeply rooted in the Lutheran intellectual tradition and boldly open to insights from other religious and secular traditions. The Warper College magazine this past summer did a feature piece on Rooted and Open. And you may or may not be able to see this closely, but one of our marketing and communications staff person did this rendering, right, of a tree. And then if you can see closely enough, the roots are sort of these theological concepts. So reforming grace, divine, hope, concern, community, presence, incarnation, creation, hope, Christian freedom, love, right, as the roots, right? And then the tree has things like wisdom, humility, service, leadership, holistic, and then the branches are very particular things like diversity, interfaith studies, ensembles, music, service, iClub, mentoring, right? Particular programs of the college. And I love this image. I think he did an amazing job sort of capturing what that means, what that looks like. So what I call the spine of the Rooted and Open statement are these 3 phrases, and they're offered up as sort of a thesis, if you will, that together these education communities equip graduates who are called and empowered to serve the neighbor so that all may flourish. And I think I take these 6 words, called, empowered, serve, neighbor, and all flourish, as some key words. And in other places I've sort of extended, reflected on how those things come out of the Lutheran theological and intellectual tradition, what that looks like on our campus today, because each of them sort of points us in a few different directions. Related to the word empowered here, a couple of statements that I want to make, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about here. Educational institutions are empowered with resources. Human resources, financial resources, place-based resources, intellectual resources, theological resources. So what are the responsibilities and the characteristics then of what do we do with these resources? What do effective transformational leaders do? What are the characteristics of educated citizens, right? These are questions that we tackle daily on our campus and people do on campuses around the country. And of course, we know that once a student is empowered, we get to see these amazing things that they do, right? They make documentaries, they produce robotics research, they support each other when they're struggling, they tutor, they teach, right? And this is sort of the purpose of empowerment in some ways, to share resources and gifts with others, to use the power that you have as an individual or as an institution to energize and to equip others. This also reflects the character of an institution, I think, the degree to which it empowers the community and the things that it empowers them to do. So is it empowering them towards service and leadership, or is it simply empowering them to profit maximization? Now, in another generation, Charlie already invoked the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I want to bring up another one of his concepts here. Bonhoeffer wrote about grace, and he criticized, a tendency that he saw in those around him to treat grace as if it were a cheap resource, meaning one that you get easily, you enjoy freely, you don't really have to think about it, the work's already been done for you, yippee, right? His argument, of course, was that it's exactly not the right way to think about grace, right? Grace is, in fact, costly. He said because it calls us to follow. It costs a person their life. Because once you are entrusted or gifted with something, what do you do with it? Right? Your job is not to just be like, yay, good for me, I have a thing. What are you doing with it, right? So some of the emerging work on vocation, much of work which is coming out of NetView, considers how our understandings of things like structural privilege and oppression relate to how and why we serve students, particularly those who've been relegated to the margins. Higher education in this country was not designed for me, right? A woman whose parents were not wealthy, who did not have college degrees when my brother and I went to school, And in fact, when I was talking about the history of Lutheran higher education with my first-year students last fall, there were about 25 of them, I pointed out that specifically Lutheran higher education was originally designed for young, white, Lutheran men who would marry women and become church leaders. So I said, how many of you in this room would not be here? Almost everybody raised their hand. Maybe 2 people were like, I'd still be like, C, right? That vision, of course, of Lutheran higher education did not persist, I think happily so. And in part because notions of vocation expanded. This is a sort of legacy of the Lutheran tradition. So did notions of who college is for and what the purpose of character formation and college education is for. Must you be Lutheran to attend Wartburg College? Of course not. Must you be male or Christian or white or heterosexual? Of course not. Thankfully not, right? We're a more robust place because that is true today. Because we have understood as an institution that being empowered by a tradition, by a heritage, doesn't mean that we just relish in it and hoard it for ourselves. It means we make a place for other people. It means we're empowered to do that. It means that we make the places we live, whether it's Waverly, Iowa, or other places that our students will go, that our roots, we understand that roots are fed by the energy of the leaves, of the buds, and that campus communities are better for it. Now, one of the manifestations, and I'll go back to this in a second, of the rootedness and openness that we see on many of the ELCA college campuses today is the emergence of interfaith studies curriculum, interfaith cooperation efforts. And here's 2 images. We all have images, right? And this is, I think, the newest. This is even newer than the encounter. This picture of the Lebenskreuz, a life cross. It's about 12 feet tall. It just went up about 3 weeks ago on the Wartburg College campus, 25th anniversary of the chapel. So it's a sculpture that is a sort of based on the Neuendettelsau cross that is inside the Wartburg chapel. It's about this tall. The Neuendettelsau cross has these depictions of the 7 acts of mercy from Matthew 25. And it is made in Neuendettelsau, Germany, which is the town from which the founders of Wartburg College were sent. So there's a deep sense of the rootedness there, right? Not only in the gospel story, but specifically in the 7 acts of mercy, the commitments to service, but also to this place in Bavaria, right? From which the founders of this college came. It's open intentionally, so you can sort of, this sits now on the edge of campus. You can see through it if you're not on campus. When you're on campus, you can look out into the world, right? There's sort of a intentional design there. It's about 12 feet high. You can kind of see with the person in the background. Another thing, the other image here is simply an additional interfaith prayer space on our campus. This is in the basement of the chapel. This was in response to the growing religious diversity on our campus. And so this sort of rootedness, openness is captured in a lot of different ways, but these are 2 images that I think capture that at the moment. And so this is a sense of, to go back to the idea of the what is grace empowering you to do, the cost of a tradition. This is another way in which Peggy McIntosh's very widely anthologized classic piece on white privilege from 1988. What will we do with the knowledge that we have? It's an open question as whether we choose to use our advantages to reconstruct power systems on a broader base or not. Different way to talk about the same kind of call, the indicators of character. To what are we called to do? Okay, second part is to talk a little bit about our current landscape. So I was thinking about this. One of the things that I learned about 10 years ago, I was an observer at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women annual meeting, and I noticed there's a striking difference between sitting in the official sessions, this is in the United Nations Assembly halls, where you have these lushly paneled rooms with official delegates, governmental ministers speaking very eloquently and very passionately and relatively truthfully about their nation's commitments to women's equality, strategic plans to achieve XYZ goals in the next decade, right? And then there's all these sort of sessions that happen around the sidelines of an event like that. There were a lot of women activists who spoke tearfully about their stories of having property confiscated by the government, struggling to get their names legally added to the title of the home that they had owned with their husband for 20 years, ragingly recounting stories of losing family members to war and state-sanctioned violence, and passionately pleading for the world to understand what's going on. So that's a very different context. But having been an undergraduate educator now in my 20th year, I can say the same thing with regard to the contrast between boardroom level conversations about institutional commitments to student success and well-being, contrasted with traumatized students sitting in my office, struggling to be heard as they tried to navigate processes of reporting assault. Presidents and deans trumpeting diversity initiatives, while Black student unions regularly presenting litanies of frustration into what seemed like an administrative void. This happened at my previous institution, happened at University of Missouri quite prominently in 2015. UC Boulder is happening right now. We also see religious life programs and other campus activities supporting service projects to others in the local community and abroad. And at the same time, more of our communities have food banks on our campuses to serve our students who are food insecure. So these are particular kinds of examples that press the case of the character of a college or university. To what degree do these guiding mission, vision, strategic plan statements enable effective responses to contemporary challenges that, frankly, our founders couldn't have envisioned? They hadn't a clue. And to what degree do those stories inhibit our work? And to that last point, are colleges and universities able to tell our stories or to retell our stories and understand our moral assignments in ways that are needed for student survival and thriving in the 21st century? So our host institution, Baylor's recent past with allegations and convictions around sexual assault committed by male student athletes, presents a case study not relevant not because it's unique, but because it's applicable to nearly every other college and university in this country. I have taught at 3 different institutions, and I've experienced challenging dynamics around campus responses to sexual assault at every single one of them. John Krakauer's meticulously researched 2015 book, Missoula, about a series of sexual assault incidents involving male student athletes at the University of Montana, likewise gives a deep dive into the practical, procedural, and institutional questions that emerge in higher education's collective failures to live into many aspects of the 1973 Title IX federal laws. Now, for colleges and universities that like the ones I currently teach, and like Baylor, who name and claim a religious heritage and guidance based on values that are derived from a religious tradition, the questions simply multiply. So, for example, the September 2014 Title IX program review and Clery Act compliance assessment report that was produced for Baylor by a consulting service, Margolis Healy, states many things. It's a 118-page long report, but sort of the beginning of the middle section, it states the following. And I'm going to sort of quote extensively here, one of Baylor University's core values is that sexual relationships are to occur exclusively within the bonds of heterosexual marriage. Interviewees routinely indicated that they struggle to address Title IX issues in ways that honor Baylor's values, but also provide students and other members of the Baylor community with the information and support they need. While OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, does not require Baylor to alter its values regarding sexual activity outside of marriage or related to consumption of alcohol, it does expect Baylor to educate its students about issues related to sexual harassment and sexual violence, including where they may go for help. Another section a little bit after that says, staff indicates that they struggle to raise the subject within the university's administrative structure because it seems inconsistent with core values. For that reason, it is a subject that is whispered about, but not addressed directly. One interviewee, seeing the dichotomy between this behavior and Baylor's obligation to serve members of its community who have experienced sexual violence and seek to prevent it, put it succinctly, we have to stop being stupid. One last point from the report. Interviewees also spoke to the assumption that students make about other members of the Baylor community because they are Christian. One interviewee explained that Baylor's messaging is that it offers a caring, wonderful Christian environment, which it does, but that Christians sometimes do things that are as wicked as others. So this is a small window into this comprehensive report about a whole lot of things. But one of the things that was mentioned in our proposal for this panel is how individuals and institutions sometimes are certain that they're called to a certain way of life that is less than salutary, and that a particular calling may be real, but its source may be in competition with other more urgent calls. So when it comes to talking about the character of an institution, what do we do when the way that our heritage and story have been interpreted and told are no longer helpful? When they emerge as part of a larger set of problems, this is where careful consideration of core values is required, and a careful, and I mean careful, openness to critical realization of when and where they're no longer serving the educational mission. Now, here's another sort of example of this. In the case of the Lutheran College, there were decisive moments along the way where vision of Lutheran higher ed had to expand or die. Institutional survival, yes, but living into the world as it is. It required thinking about the gospel mandate that roots the theological tradition, but adopting an accompaniment model of ministry rather than a conversion model. That it isn't the job of a Lutheran college to make more Lutherans anymore. It is the job of a Lutheran college to meet the needs of the world for doctors, teachers, engineers, pastors, entrepreneurs, right? Because that's the work that God calls the church to do. The roots remain in the gospel, but the openness is to all of our students. And so there are also ways in which we can think about telling the truth in relationship to the parts of our heritage that are deeply problematic. Again, when it comes to the story of the Lutheran College, we have a responsibility to look at ways that Luther's writings on the Jews continue to feed white supremacy. We have a responsibility to repudiate, push back, live differently. There's a couple of images up here that capture this. This is from 360 Panorama Art exhibition in Wittenberg, Germany, where Luther is depicted in the middle as people are being sort of expelled from Wittenberg, and the Jews among them, and there's a Jewish man sort of right in the middle who's dropped all of his stuff, and he's in the mud, and he's trying to pick up his stuff, he's getting trampled, and Luther's just standing there, just looking at him. The other picture is from St. Mary's Church in Wittenberg, which is the church in which Luther was the pastor, in which he preached regularly for the bulk of his career. And on one corner of it is the very offensive anti-Semitic sculpture, the Judensau, that depicts, it's a pig. It has Jewish children suckling the pig, and it has a rabbi looking up the pig's rear end for the name of God. And there's a Shem for us on the top. Luther refers to this image in his sermons. Of course he would. This predates Luther. It's like, see, this is how silly the Jews are. This is where they find this name of God. Right? So there's this deeply problematic stuff embedded in the tradition. So how do we deal with that, right? This is where our story, Lutheran College story, includes writings from the 16th century monk, and I think it sheds light on our moral assignments, not only because of the positive, wonderful legacy of freedom and service that we get, but also because it sheds light on our moral assignment to do something better, to do it differently than what Luther did when he was confronted with the religious other, and he just let him lay in the mud. So every college and university in the U.S. today has a responsibility to understand the ways that its structures and procedures were not designed for the world that it is today, to serve the vulnerable, to name ways that these procedures have protected the powerful, the status quo. This is also because the modern university today is also enmeshed in corporate capitalism that sets up a real competition for its telos, for its goals. So I think we're all invited to carefully consider our stories, to have and to develop the ability to balance heritage and mission, past and future, and the roots and the branches. I'm confident that we can figure out ways to do better in the future. Thank you.
So just a minute to conclude. The opportunities for further conversation are in this room, and I hope you'll all chime in and participate in that. For those of you who are from institutions that are not yet, I like to say, members of NetView, membership is something that you may want to consider. There's some propaganda on the back table back there if you want to read up about it. A couple of very specific things to our conversation about institutions here that are coming up. A regional event coming up at Lipscomb University next month called Colleges Can Have Callings Too, addressing exactly this question, along with a number of other regional gatherings that happen throughout the year. And then we've just recently announced a grant opportunity for NetView member institutions called Grants for Reframing the Institutional Saga. And it's very germane to what's just being said, and especially, Caryn, to how you closed your presentation, thinking about what are the roots of our institutional traditions, what have we inherited, and where are we going from here? And the idea of this grant is to give institutions an opportunity to rethink that heritage in the wake of their, or in the face of their current contexts, which are often very different than the ones that are now. You gave the example at the beginning of the Lutheran higher education was originally for white, male, heterosexual men who married women and were going to leave the church, right? None of those things are the case for Lutheran higher ed now. So how do you incorporate that heritage and yet open it to the future in one way or another? A lot of other NetView programs and services are on the website, and I encourage you to dig around in there and find out more about it. But these have been three fabulous offerings for our conversation here today. So I hope folks will ask questions, perhaps maybe offer some stories from your own institutional context where you see some of these same kinds of things going on. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So, floor is open. Carl, jump in.
I have a question about the engagement with the statue piece, this experiential education model. We are very much in the building phase at my institution. We have this grand 9-foot statue of our founder, John Tarleton. And we have some rituals associated with it. Students are encouraged to take a selfie with John T. We have coffee with John T. But it's very much not the interactive statue because it's the heroic figure. And then we have another one of General Earl Rudder up on a pedestal. And then we have this ritual for football games where we meet at the Earl Rudder statue, we compare the other team to the Germans, and it's uncomfortable. But at least there's a ritual there. But mostly our statues and our other campus landmarks are not sort of accessible for student programs or use. So how do we get the people who make decisions about what to build on campus on board with this model of using campus landmarks as part of experiential education?
Yeah, it's a good question. In our case, we had a donor who initially did want this thing to be on top of a pedestal. He wanted it up high because he thought that that's what the value of it was. And we convinced him that the figure of the statue itself, De La Salle, he himself was a very practical person. I mean, he was creating materials and running schools and founding formation programs for teachers. And so everything he did has always been very practical. And so putting De La Salle down on the level of the viewer was a very practical move on our part. I without knowing more about who the decision makers are or who's involved in the design, I don't know that I can really say, but I think if you go into it with this notion that for something to be experiential, it needs to be something that people can interact with in a different kind of way, then that might help with the design. The other thing is sometimes people see value in these things. You know, I like the two photos you shared because those are down at a person's level, and it's meant to be touched or at least gotten close to, and people can take photos with them, and even the sculptures that you showed on your campus are still very accessible, that you can get right up next to them. You can sit down next to the woman on the bench. So I guess you have to go into that with that in mind in the design process.
I'd add to that, an interesting question to ask of decision makers is, ask at other institutions, what's the monument on campus that students remember best? And I'll bet you 90% of the time it'll be something that they can get up close to and take a picture of. I mean, on Hope's campus, there's a big anchor out in on a pedestal, kind of a short pedestal, right? But you can climb up on it, and it's the symbol of hope, right? And all of that sort of thing. But people take pictures with it all the time. Groups, graduation pictures. There's a line a mile long, people wanting to take pictures. And in some ways, it's you have to dig deep to know the relationship between the anchor and the word hope and all of that sort of thing. But it's certainly the image on campus that students know the best, much more than any work of art or monument or sculpture or stained glass window or something like that. And I think that would be an interesting way into it. I'll guarantee you that your students are going to know this one best, right? Because of that. And I think that's probably true at a lot of campuses.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm so interested in us protecting the richness of the concept of vocation from the heritage that you all represent. And a few years ago when President Obama started talking about education to employment and the report card and all that, our provost said, let's talk about education to vocation. And I was both excited and worried at the same time, because in conflating employment with vocation, something happens. And so I don't know if y'all have thoughts on how even people of faith who don't know the story of vocation and all the heritage that comes with our traditions and the power behind that idea, how to educate people to not just do the replacement thing, education, employment, job, vocational training, all the things that take a beautiful, amazing thing in our history and diminish its potential. Can it help? I think it can help, but then people up in public places use it in a sort of sloppy way, and that bothers me. What can we do?
I guess part of my remarks were that we need to recognize that vocation always involves suffering. And that's not a word that's brought up when you talk about the job you're going to get. So I think that's deeply embedded in the Christian tradition, even though it's easy to forget it even there. So I suppose, and then I think coming to suffering and also recognizing the meaning within suffering, particularly in relation to Christ. And that the Christian vocation is always then to follow Christ. And you can't confuse working, whatever job you're working, with that, I don't think.
The word passion helps there too.
Yeah.
One of the things that, so within the Lutheran context of a Lutheran college or university, we have the fortuitous opportunity to use Luther, right? And to continually also go back to his point that vocation wasn't singular, it's multiple, right? It's vocations, indicating that, and that pushes us beyond the careerism and employment kind of stuff to say, you have calls when it comes to your engagement with your community. You have calls in terms of family life. You have calls in terms of being a friend. You have, right? So that calls happen in many ways, right? And Luther talked about that, yes. Right? So parenting, he came too late in life for many reasons, but he delighted in that. He delighted in being a husband. He thought that these were, really significant parts of the work that God called him to do as well. So, we get to draw on that. I mean, lots of people get to draw on that, but it's an easy conversation partner when you're at a Lutheran college, right? But to lift that up for students as well as for administrators too, is we're not just, and we know this is the changing nature of the economy, we can't educate students for employment because we don't know what employment is going to be around in 5 years, right? So expanding it and that capaciousness that David talked about.
The Luther piece is helpful there to think about not employment, but the call to be a worker.
Correct.
Which embodies itself in different ways, can help it be broader than just job.
Yep, exactly.
I'd say also that with the nephew institution, despite the word vocation in the organization's name, we've tried to suggest repeatedly that there's nothing really sacred about the word. If the word doesn't work in your context for whatever reason, and it doesn't in a lot of contexts, there may be theological reasons why it's complicated in some cases, in the Roman Catholic context, for so long, vocation was so uniquely associated with religious life that sometimes, people will report to me, I use that word on my campus, people run in the opposite direction, right? And we're trying to avoid that also. Or if vocation, certainly was the case when I was growing up, vocational training was you want to be a welder, right? So if that's the context you're in, then maybe there's an alternative description. And really, because it's the translation essentially, calling is sometimes more helpful, right? Because if you say what's your vocation, people might interpret that as just a job. But if you say what's your calling, people are likely to push it a little harder, I think. And that's one that I think has been pretty successful. So Charlie's description of his, conversation about the idea of call pushes you to think in bigger, broader, more philosophically and theologically complicated ways, I think, about the concept.
I wish all, yes, please. No, go ahead.
It seems that most of the Christian universities we've discussed often have very conservative allegiances politically, and yet there's this push for diversity and inclusion that is typically associated with very liberal traits. So how do you navigate that sort of difference between claiming to be conservative politically, yet seeming to embrace more liberal values and what we're trying to do?
It's a good question. It's interesting because I think the equation with sort of diversity and inclusion with liberal values, I think, is probably a false branding. And that's my gut reaction at the moment, is that if we're going to educate and equip students to be successful in the world, they're going to, of necessity, live and work with people who are not like them, politically, religiously, racially, in terms of gender, right? So we do our students a service if we equip them to operate in that world. And so there's a very practical thing going on there, regardless of sort of political affiliations or religious convictions. So that's just kind of a base level place to start. So I'll sort of say that.
Good.
Others?
Yeah.
Catelyn, want to grab that one?
Yeah, I guess one thing I seem to be aware, brought to the awareness of, that they live in the United States, in which these kinds of bifurcations are so consistent and they grab us. And I guess I would say two things that defense against it. One is actually some students care, but most students don't give a damn, I think. I think that's true, at least in my institution. They don't care much about politics, and so they're not sort of drawn one way or the other. I don't know how they land there. Eventually, they probably do. But I don't find that they're eager to go in that direction. I don't know whether you have a different experience. Like, okay, we are conservative. These are our values. So they're just relatively inattentive to those things, it seems to me. And then the other thing is that I think that's one of the things that I would try to argue in my paper is that you have to become aware of the degree to which we serve an American God. And I think the religious institutions, I should hope, would try their best to reach for what the tradition tells them is the true God. And I don't know, I guess I think that that should be in our classrooms, and for the consistent identification of how our mode of thinking and our way of being is so informed by American culture. And that let's hope that there's some way in the university we can find a way out of that. And surely Call does. Call ought to give us another way.
Could I ask a quick last question? I wish our president, provost, deans of all of our 8 colleges had been here in the schools to hear these wonderful presentations. So let me ask their question for them. Baylor costs $250,000 for a 4-year education. And parents are saying, we are not going to shell out that kind of bucks for our kids to wait tables at Olive Garden. So, you see where things are leading? Business is now the tail that wags the dog in most schools, not just the big public schools. I heard just this week at the flagship evangelical college in this nation, whom I need not name, had as its majority number of freshman enrollees major in business. So how does this cash out at your schools? What percentage of your student body majors in business? And we find this talk all very nice and well, but it won't get my kid a job.
Well, that's, I sort of very briefly nodded at the end of my talk, my time about the American God. We're enmeshed in capitalism, right? And we can't not be. I think this is something that I'll speak for myself, continue to struggle with, and just believe that there's something there that when parents are like, why, that's why telling, I think the stories help us be the distinctive places. That's why I think that, lifting up the whether it's a religious identity, the intellectual tradition, the origin story of the college or university, you're going to get a different kind of experience at a place like this. So that's one thing that I would say while we're still enmeshed in capitalism, serving the American God.
I guess the question would always be, what's the difference between a business major at your institution and a business major at the big public down the road? And there ought to be one, right? Yep. And then you got to be able to tell that story in a way that people will say, okay, it is worth the extra money to shell out to the private institution, because in addition to being a business major, my child is going to have a sense of what it's all about. Right. We hope for that, right?
We hope for that, right, exactly.
I might pass on a practical suggestion along these lines. One person in our gargantuan business school hit upon the idea of honor students there being named business fellows. And those business fellows then are given the chance to take courses across the whole spectrum. In fact, they're required to, of the humanities. And those are positions that people seek out to be named business fellows. Now, we're an 18,000 student institution. It may not be possible at your schools to do that. That's one thing that business schools can do, to create honors programs within them that emphasize the humanities and thus keep the cachet of liberal arts and Christian tradition.
Yeah, I think the significance of the core. I served for many years as a chair of our theology department, and we were consistently facing that maybe they would be cut back in the core. And we fought that battle as hard as we could. And I do think that if all students, at least at my university, I think probably yours, probably at Baylor, there is at least this core that so that students now understand, maybe, that in these courses they're hopefully open to something else than what they study in business. And that if they can in the least open their minds to such a possibility, I think the university functions in a different way than it does in a secular arena.
We've just revised our core along those very lines. You won't be surprised at what the new core is centered around: social justice. Well, thank you all. It's been a very good session. Let's thank our speakers.